welcome you all to the MedRhythms Videocast series. This is a monthly series where we'll be talking to world experts in the field of neurology, research, rehabilitation, and music, and discussing all things rehabilitation, music and neuroscience, digital therapeutics. And each month we feature a new expert who will provide valuable insight into these important topics. This show is hosted by me, Brian Harris, the co-founder and CEO of MedRhythms, a digital therapeutics company that's focusing at the intersection of neuroscience, technology, and music to build interventions that transform the lives of those living with neurologic injury or disease. If you'd like to learn more about MedRhythms, please visit our website at www.medrhythms.com. I hope that you find today's episode interesting, meaningful, and compelling, and I believe that you will. Today, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. John DeLuca. Dr. John DeLuca is the Senior Vice President for Research and Training at Kessler Foundation, a professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and Department of Neurology at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. He is board certified in rehabilitation psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. DeLuca has been involved in neuropsychology and rehabilitation research for over 30 years. He is internationally known for his research on disorders of memory and information processing in a variety of clinical populations, including multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain injury, aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage, and chronic fatigue syndrome. Dr. DeLuca has published over 350 articles, books, and book chapters in these areas, has edited 7 books in neuropsychology, neuroimaging, and rehabilitation, and is a co-editor for the Encyclopedia of Clinical Neuropsychology. He has received over $38 million in grant support for his research. Dr. DeLuca's most recent research ventures include the cerebral mapping of human cognitive processes using functional neuroimaging, as well as the development of research-based techniques to improve cognitive impairment. He serves on the editorial boards of many journals and has received numerous national and international awards in recognition of his work. Dr. DeLuca is also a member of the MedRhythms Scientific Advisory Board. Welcome, John. It's an honor to have you here today.
Thank you, Brian. It's my honor as well.
And I guess, John, just to get us started, could you tell us a little bit more about the Kessler Foundation and your role there?
Sure. Kessler Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization whose mission is to support the work of people with disabilities. And so we really have 2 parts to our mission. The smaller part is we actually provide funding to other not-for-profit organizations to actually work towards hiring people with disabilities, getting them to have a meaningful employment. And that's a part of what we do. The larger part of what we do, and the part that I'm engaged in, is in research with persons with disabilities, in all aspects of research. Primarily, though, in areas of cognition, mobility, the combination of the two, and in outcomes, in their functional outcomes. We have about 160 employees and really been in business to really help people with disabilities.
Well, with 160
translational rehabilitation research, sorry.
Oh, no, please. 160 employees, you must, I mean, that's a significant amount of research that's probably done. How does that compare to other sort of organizations in the country doing research here? Is that big? Is that small? Is that about average?
You know, most people think about large research universities. So compared to Harvard or Yale, or, we're tiny. But we have a focused mission. Mm-hmm. And our organization is probably one of, if not the largest research or non-for-profit research organization focused on persons with disabilities in the country.
Excellent, excellent. And you mentioned this a little bit, but could you tell us a bit more about the types of research activities that you do at the Kessler Foundation?
Yeah, like I say, we focus a lot on cognition, mobility, and outcome. And the focus really is on, like I say, translational rehabilitation research. We want to get the next generation of treatment into practice. That's really the focus of our work. We're not like, we don't end our research by journal publications. We then take our research into practice. And one of our major laboratories is Kessler Institute for Rehabilitation, which is in the same building. So our research subjects are oftentimes their inpatients. and their new and innovative ways of treating patients are our funded research that we've been able to show, oftentimes a class 1 evidence, that it actually improves not only their function, but their everyday life. And what's going on within the body, as we have our own neuroimaging center here. So we can actually look at changes in the nervous system, and how that relates to behavioral change and improvement in their treatment in everyday life. So it's really quite a great way to be able to change practice from rehabilitation research.
And very an impressive mission to really be focused on that translational aspect of it as well, and to have the sort of robust infrastructure to be able to do that from neuroimaging across to translational research. Are there any current studies that you can tell us about that that the Kessler Foundation is doing currently?
We have a lot of really incredible aspects of things. One of the newest things is that we've established a Center for Spinal Stimulation. And it's really involved in transcutaneous stimulation, where we stimulate the nervous system, the spinal cord, just from the outside of the body, but also epidural stimulation, where we actually do surgical implants of a stimulator, and we stimulate the spinal cord in wherever we need to do so, and we study the algorithm that it takes for individuals to get the right kind of stimulation that they need. And it's been incredibly wonderful. People who just have no movement for years and years and years are all of a sudden able to do things like throw a baseball for the first time to their kid. And when you see a story like that, it's just absolutely incredible, where a person could never do that, and that's their dream. And we have these things on videotape. It's just absolutely wonderful. So Center for Spinal Stimulation has been phenomenal. On another extreme, we do a lot of work with autism. And so it's interesting because in autism, you don't see a lot of mobility issues. You don't see a lot of cognitive issues. You see primarily things with social cognition. And that is, individuals are having a difficult time interacting with the environment in a social domain. So, for example, persons with autism might have a difficult time reading the social cues of the person that they're speaking with. So if they're not able to understand an emotion in another person, such as feeling sad or feeling upset or angry, they themselves don't know how to respond because they're not getting the proper social cues. So there's research in that area. A really nice and innovative NIH-funded project is actually getting teenagers with autism to actually go through a work environment and using an avatar in the cyberspace to understand how to do a job interview. And once it's interesting because if, for example, during an interview, the interviewee asked the person with autism, "Tell me about your strengths," you might get the response like, "Well, I have big muscles." You know, that's just not the kind of response, of course, that you'd want to give, but that is a kind of a response that a person with autism could do. So you give them the feedback, you get them to understand through an interview with an avatar. So it's really quite interesting. And we've got lots of great things going on with brain injury, multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injury in terms of looking at cognition in spinal cord injury. And all of this has to do with rehabilitation. Really fascinating work.
It's quite a spectrum from social cognition to spinal stimulation, right? It's incredible to hear the robustness of that spectrum. And what about you specifically in your background? Obviously, you're a career researcher. Hundreds of publications. Where are your research interests?
Yeah, I would say at the most broad level, I'm interested in cognition. I'm interested in its treatment, so cognitive rehabilitation. I'm interested in its impact on everyday life. That's really important. I'm also interested in what's going on in the nervous system what's going on in the brain for people who are having problems with cognition. What are the changes in the brain with cognitive rehabilitation? And how does all of that affect the person and their everyday lives in their environment? It's not enough just to say, I can show that with this intervention, I can improve your memory, and I can do so by showing increased activation between the hippocampus and other areas of the brain, or increased functional connectivity. Does it have a meaningful change in their lives? That's really important to me and the kind of work that we do here. I'm also very, very interested in fatigue and studying fatigue, because fatigue is a very difficult construct to understand. The more we have a better understanding of what fatigue is, the greater chance we're going to be able to find some kind of some treatment for something as nebulous as fatigue.
It's very interesting, and we're going to dive into a couple of those topics here in a moment. And as we think about, diving in a little bit more specific, you mentioned a lot about cognition, and in your bio it talks about cognitive processing and the impacts of research-based techniques to improve cognitive impairments. Can you describe to the audience, that's likely more of the lay person audience, what cognitive impairments actually look like across disease states? Are they common? It's an area of research. How common are these cognitive impairments?
It's really interesting, because when you think about cognition, we're really talking about the 3-pound mass that's in our head, the brain, which is 75% water. So that 3-pound mass, when it's affected, whether it's by a disease such as multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease, or some kind of environmental insult, like a traumatic brain injury, or some kind of neurotoxin, or neurodegeneration from like Alzheimer's, it's going to affect how we think. It's going to affect how we perceive emotions, how we exhibit emotions, how we perceive emotions in other people, like I say, in social cognition. So, and it can do so at a very subtle effect, like from a concussion, or like I say, very severe injury, like a severe traumatic brain injury. And so the kinds of impact on cognition can vary dramatically based on a variety of factors. If you think about something more subtle, like a concussion, and many people have had concussions, the brain can have a subtle effect, oftentimes, where it's just not as efficient as it used to be. And that usually results in slowed processing speed. Our speed by which we can perform cognitive tasks may become slower. And that can be maintained for a long period of time, such as with a more serious disease. But even in a concussion, that can resolve. It can get better. But you can sort of feel like, I'm not the same. Something's wrong. You don't really get the feeling of it. And a lot of times that's just processing speed is less efficient. You can think about the reverberating circuits in our brain of the neurons that have been developed over decades of making us efficient. And has it been disrupted? Not necessarily broken, but disrupted to the point where we're just not as efficient. And with treatment, or even with time, like in a concussion, it can get back to hopefully 100%, and sometimes not. Aging can have a dramatic effect on cognition. And usually, again, processing speed and memory. A lot of times the complaints that people have are with memory. And my memory is just not the same. And it does happen with age, sorry. It happens to all of us, and processing speed does happen with all of us. But a lot of times the complaints of memory are not necessarily memory. It can be what's called executive function. And that is the part of the brain that controls our cognitive activity. So sometimes we need to inhibit a response. And sometimes the brain is not working properly. You may not inhibit that response. Sometimes you need to initiate a response. And persons with executive function may not initiate, they may not start the behavior. Even though they know what the behavior is and remember what the behavior is, you may not be able to get it started. These are executive processes. Doing several things simultaneously is an executive process that works with an efficient brain, but sometimes if it's not so efficient, it's hard to do several things simultaneously. These are called executive processing. But oftentimes the complaint of a patient is, my memory is just not the same. And therefore, to really understand what the problem is, you have to do an assessment. And the only way to treat what the problem is to make sure you do a good assessment. Otherwise, you'd be treating the wrong thing. So that's in brief what we think about when we're talking about cognition. But it's really the highest level of human functioning. So never going to be an easy thing to assess and treat.
Right. And you talked a lot about memory, and the broad spectrum here of cognition. What are some of the research-based techniques to improve those impairments? I think maybe a lot of viewers say, well, I'll do crossword puzzles, I do Sudoku, these types of things. What are some of the actual research-based techniques to help improve these cognitive impairments?
Yeah, there are a lot of things out there. It's interesting because I want to hit the area of cognitive reserve, and then I'm going to come back to some very specific treatment techniques. But it's interesting, the brain, it has an influence of genetics, but it also has a really big influence of the environment. And we know that a lifetime of environmentally stimulating activities, such as music, such as a lot of reading, such as education, we know that building a brain from the environment can be such that it's less susceptible to the effects of the disease. It's called cognitive reserve. And that is that the brain can build more connections. It can have a thicker cortex just from the environment, so that when you get a disease, that the expression of that disease on cognition will not be as great than if you've had lower cognitive reserve. That is, even though I have the same level of, say, brain loss from multiple sclerosis, my cognition can be maintained for a longer period of time because of the reserve built through it for a lifetime of stimulating activities. So people talk about.
Just to be clear, John, if I can just double click on that for a moment. So this is actually saying that there's been shown to be a correlation of an actual active preventative nature by virtue of our own actions. It's not just, oh, my brain is different or their brain is different by the way they were born, but by actually engaging in different types of stimulation, you can build protection against future diseases that may happen.
Not future diseases necessarily, but the impact of the diseases. Yes. So you still might get the disease, yes, but you may not know. So for example, people often confuse Alzheimer's and dementia. A lot of studies have shown that 25% of people at autopsy have had Alzheimer's, but they may not have been showing any signs of dementia. Well, why is that? Because one example is if you've had a very high level of cognitive reserve, you've not hit the level where you start to see the impact of the dementia. Right. A lot of individuals with lower cognitive reserve might show the dementia early in the disease. So there's not a real one-to-one correlation relationship between disease and impact. And the point that you picked up on is that the environment can have a strong impact on whether the disease, whether you see the impact of that disease. What a great way for us to be able to work towards maintaining a healthy lifestyle in terms of cognition. So that's a really important part of thinking about just everyday life, is build that cognitive reserve. But if you've had brain damage or a brain injury, one of the things you want to do is build a cognitive reserve. And people talk about the brain games and such, which are not rehabilitation, but it's something that everybody can do to try to build that cognitive reserve. But let me give you some other very specific examples of how we treat people with cognitive problems. Let's talk about aging, healthy aging. there have been now numerous studies showing that computerized treatment for processing speed, so try to improve your speed of processing, can significantly improve your speed of processing, number one, but also have a significant impact on the environment. So studies have shown that processing speed training, that 5 years later, individuals who've gone through the treatment group compared to an active placebo group, which didn't get the training, but got everything else, didn't get the active ingredient, 5 years later, they have fewer car crashes in their everyday life. And 10 years later, 10 years after treatment, there's significant decline in diagnosis of dementia if you've received the processing speed treatment 10 years earlier. Wow. So the idea that a behavioral treatment can actually improve your behavior and everyday life is something that we should all understand clearly, because 20, 30 years ago, people wouldn't believe this. That you can have a behavioral intervention to influence the brain to maintain or improve cognitive function and diminish the chance of dementia. These are wonderful new research kinds of things that we can do and we know. And those techniques for processing speed, for example, we utilize in our work with persons with traumatic brain injury after an insult or in multiple sclerosis. And so we can use these techniques, and therapists have the knowledge to be able to provide improvements in processing speed, treatment for learning and memory problems, treatment for executive dysfunction. So there's really a lot of promising things out there.
Amazing. It's an exciting, I mean, we could, I think, have a whole conversation purely on that point alone and really dig in there. But it's exciting to see that with the advancements of research and sort of how accessible these things could be to people's everyday lives to be able to improve long-term outcomes, which I think is such a compelling aspect of this.
Yeah.
I want to dive in a little bit more about MS specifically. We can talk a bit about cognition there as well. As we sort of make this transition into MS, could you, for the audience, just describe what MS is and some of the different types of MS?
Yeah, MS is a disease which attacks the nervous system. It's sort of an autoimmune disease. That means that the immune system in our bodies attacks our nervous system. It thinks there's something wrong. So it attacks our nervous system, and it results in decreased immune system response. Later on in the disease, it results in neurodegeneration, degeneration of the actual nervous system, neurons in the brain. And so it's interesting because it was always thought to be a white matter disease. That is a disease of the outer part of axons, which make neurons, nerve systems faster. We now know over just 20 years that it actually affects the brain cells themselves, and it can actually decrease the number of cells that we have in our brain. So it's a really slow process. So you may not notice some of the changes over time, but it can certainly affect things like cognition, mobility, its combination, and everyday life. Exactly what we study. So when you think about cognition, in particular in MS, there's something called clinically isolated syndrome. That is really a diagnosis before the diagnosis of MS, because we think you have MS, but you don't meet the formal definition. But about a third of individuals with CIS already have cognitive problems. Earlier in the disease, during a relapsing remitting phase, where symptoms are sort of coming and going. They sort of have symptoms, and then they sort of relapse, and then they come back. About 50% of individuals with relapsing remitting MS have cognitive impairment. And about 80% of relapsing remitting subjects move on to a chronic progressive stage, a secondary stage where the disease becomes more progressive. Rather than bouncing up and down with symptoms, you start getting worse. And about 80 to 90% of those individuals show cognitive impairment. Now, it's important to realize that MS is a very heterogeneous disease also. So there can be people early in the disease that have cognitive impairment and early that they don't have cognitive impairment. Or in the later in the disease, you can have, while 80 to 90% can have cognitive impairment, many may not. And the same thing with mobility problems. So it's very individualized. So these are on average the kinds of things that you find in terms of cognition and even in mobility in persons with MS. Very devastating, has a significant impact on everyday life in persons with MS, and therefore why we do the research to study how we improve cognition, how we improve mobility in MS.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think, as we even dive in a little bit more specific, we talked a lot about cognition here. And you mentioned a little bit earlier, specifically your interest in fatigue as it relates to MS, et cetera. And can you tell us a little bit more about how you define fatigue? And I know in the world of research, there's a difference between cognitive fatigue and physical fatigue. And give us a bit more about that landscape.
Well, fatigue is the #1 symptom in MS. Up to 95%, depending on how you define it in certain studies, show that the patients will complain of some degree of fatigue. It really is the major problem. And the major aspect of it is that we really have a difficult time defining it. So we humans like to dichotomize what we don't understand. We like to think of night and day, left and right, male and female. So one dichotomy is cognitive fatigue and physical fatigue. Well, I don't believe that there is a cognitive fatigue part of the brain and a physical fatigue part of the brain. I think the brain, one of the brain aspects of being inefficient is fatigue. The brain cannot roll as it used to be and gets to a point where it starts to feel like I can't go anymore. That's the fatigue part. If you're doing a lot of cognitive activity, you're going to experience cognitive fatigue. If you're doing a lot of physical activity, you're going to experience physical fatigue. In reality, you're experiencing the brain's not able to go as quickly as possible, move as efficiently as possible. Just like we talked about processing speed, fatigue is telling the body, I can't go anymore, whether it's physical or mental. So I think the idea of physical or cognitive fatigue is just simply a different manifestation of this brain inefficiency, saying it's difficult for me to go anymore. And persons with MS can experience both. And depending on the nature of their work, if you do a lot of cognitive activity in your everyday life, such as a CEO of a company, you may be experiencing a lot of cognitive fatigue. Maybe not so much physical fatigue, although, you can get both. It's not so simple. But we don't have a good way of assessing fatigue. Typically, we assess fatigue by asking the patient, how fatigued are you? Do you think this fatigue affect your everyday life? Is your fatigue mild, moderate, or severe? Well, if it's severe, then we'll do something. Imagine, going to your doctor and saying, my leg hurts. And the doctor asks, saying, well, is it mild, moderate, or severe? It's severe. Oh, okay, I guess we're going to have to do something. Well, no, you do an examination.
Right.
But there's no examination for fatigue. It's this nebulous construct. And because it's nebulous and not tangible, we tend to focus a lot on patient self-report, which, by the way, is very important to understand what the patients are saying. We need to listen to our patients. But our job as doctors is to understand what they mean, not just what they say. And that is really what's hard with fatigue. So in our work, we try to quantify fatigue by getting past the nebulous part. Because, for example, in the fatigue, there's these instruments, these questionnaires that people ask with fatigue. And a lot of times, part of those questionnaires are questions that have nothing to do with fatigue, such as sleep. Oftentimes, they ask questions about sleep, but we know that sleep and fatigue are two different things. We know that. Physiologically different. Response to treatment is different. The actual treatment itself could be different. So that's why some of these questionnaires are not exactly, they're contaminated by things like sleep. So what we do is we know that fatigue can influence performance if that performance is a continuous task. Just to jump back a little bit, for over 100 years, we've thought that fatigue was related to behavioral performance. So too much fatigue means I can't work cognitively, or too much fatigue means I can't do physical activity. And while that's true to some extent, the data is not really clear. Fatigue does not always result in decreased cognitive performance. So the one area, though, is sustained cognitive performance can be affected by fatigue. So what we do is we want to understand the nature of fatigue and how it impacts the brain. So we'll have individuals with MS or traumatic brain injury put in an MRI scanner. And an MRI, you can not only look at a picture of the brain, but you can look at how the brain is functioning. You can look at functional brain activity based on blood flow in the brain. And we know that there's increased activity if there's more blood flow to a certain part of the brain and less blood flow in another part of the brain. So we put individuals in a scanner and we ask them to do cognitive tasks for a long period of time, 45 minutes, same task over and over, 8 times. And we ask them how fatigued they are at the beginning of the task, the end of the task. Then we do it again and again and again. So we can now relate their cognitive, their self-reported fatigue to what's going on in the brain and to the behavior on the task. And the nice thing is what we find is a pretty nice relationship between increased fatigue over time, because you're getting cognitively fatiguing them, and what areas of the brain are becoming more active. So maybe for the first time, we have a way of showing a biomarker of fatigue in the brain. And that's really important because now that we have this biomarker, what actually interventions can we do to see how that biomarker changes? Before that, we had to rely on self-reported fatigue. And reliance on self-reported fatigue, which is contaminated by some of these other things like sleep, have always been difficult to find any real treatment effects. So that's the exciting part about the work that we're doing with fatigue.
That's amazing. Could you maybe a little bit more about what are those areas of the brain that are impacted by fatigue that you're seeing becoming more activated? And then I think as a follow-up to that, which you hinted at, what are some of the interventions now that are being developed to address these issues?
Yeah, so one of the major focus areas of the brain that's involved in fatigue is called the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia people have thought about for decades as a motor part of the brain. And it is a motor part of the brain. It's important because if you look at people with Parkinson's disease, usually there's a focus on the basal ganglia because they're losing dopamine in the basal ganglia, and therefore the treatment is increased dopamine. And we've known that for a long time. But we also know, just in the last several decades, that the basal ganglia also has a very important cognitive aspect to it. And not only cognitive, now we're seeing that fatigue is really important for the basal ganglia. And what aspect of the basal ganglia? A very complicated system. But one part of the basal ganglia that's involved with connections in the other parts of the brain is called the reward system of the brain. It's interesting because when people are rewarded, we see activation in the basal ganglia. And so the basal ganglia and its connections with other parts of the brain, particularly the frontal regions, ventral medial frontal cortex, as well as the thalamus, seem to be major aspects of this network. And the network, by the way, is something that we see not just in MS. We've seen the same thing in traumatic brain injury, patients with Gulf War syndrome, which fatigue is a major aspect, and healthy control. So it's a pretty robust network. So what kinds of things can we do then when we talk about treatment? Well, interesting, coming back to the whole reward system. when people in cognitive neuroscience study reward, they're looking at the basal ganglia and its reward and its connections with other parts of the brain. When we're studying fatigue, we're finding that the basal ganglia is involved and its connections with other parts of the brain. So what if you bring these two people together, two literatures together, what are they saying? Can we then maybe find that can reward affect fatigue? So we've actually run now a couple studies, and there is data in the healthy literature that increasing reward has an effect on the basal ganglia. Well, maybe it affects fatigue. So we ran a couple studies now where we've actually rewarded patients in a sort of a gambling-like task and looked at their fatigue over time. Remember, they would get more fatigued over time, and they'd get changes in the basal ganglia and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. When we actually reward patients, we find that their fatigue goes down and there's changes in basal ganglia of the brain. Just think about that again. Another behavioral environmental treatment that can potentially affect fatigue. And a second study that we ran was exercise. We had patients perform exercise in their home, which we monitored remotely, and found that the same kind of thing with exercise, decreased fatigue, and had an effect on this basal ganglia-based system in the brain. And what's interesting to me is it exercise or is it rewarding? Is the exercise rewarding and therefore having an effect? You can imagine, now not everybody likes to exercise, but if exercise can be rewarding, that then can have an effect on fatigue. I don't like to exercise that much, but I do like physical activity, which is different. And I was just saying, I've been involved in softball lately. For me, physical activity, which is sort of competitive, is rewarding. I do that. But you ask me to do weights and to run just on my own, not so rewarding. So for me, if I were to want to have an effect on my basal ganglia system to reduce fatigue, I'd want to do something more rewarding in terms of exercise. So if exercise is rewarding and affects fatigue, we should find an exercise that people like to do. Now, it may be that exercise has a direct effect, or maybe it is that it also has an effect because it's rewarding, or both. Plenty of research to do here. Figure that out.
Yeah, it's very compelling, John. And as you know, we think about, at MedRhythms, we're building digital therapeutics to improve walking. So the correlation that I go here and I think about a lot is, really across disease states. So we're most advanced in our chronic stroke asset, which is being studied with the Kessler Foundation. There's early research in the actual intervention that we do of rhythmic auditory stimulation to be able to use rhythm as an external cueing mechanism to improve outcomes in walking in MS. So the early data there. We're launching a couple of trials in that area now. And, but as we think about across our pipeline of all of these disease states that you talk about, and we think about the ones that actually also have motor deficits, and as you mentioned, in MS, et cetera, and we see this across disease states, that it often manifests in motor deficits and cognitive deficits. Now, if there's a motor deficit, if by virtue of improving walking, or let's just keep it simple there, if we can improve gait to somehow allow people to exercise more, could that then, transitive property, impact cognition? By virtue of, or is there something else about it that needs to be present? Or is it really the true sort of exercise as the correlate to cognition as we understand it? Or is there something else in that puzzle that needs to be there? Or do we not know now?
Well, I think we don't know, because there is data on just exercise alone in aging literature can improve cognition. There's some data on exercise and schizophrenia that can improve cognition. But I think the interesting factor here is the exercise that is rewarding
Mm.
can have the greatest effect. So you're talking about rhythmic movement as opposed to running outside, which I don't like to do, especially in the hot weather, this and that. But if you had rhythmic activity, listening to music and moving, that could be much more motivating, much more enticing, rewarding, to the point where that can have a greater effect because of the reward system. So it could be the movement itself, it could be the fact that it's rewarding, it could be that it's because it's rewarding, you're more likely to use the movement. The combination, in some respect, it doesn't matter what it is. But from a research perspective, if reward is really important and you can find movements that are rewarding, then you're really going to potentially have a much greater effect than if you just told the patient, go exercise, go to the gym, come back and see me in 3 months. You know, a lot of that's not going to happen.
It's very interesting. And it's an interesting sort of segue into, well, one being our next conversation next month in July, where we're going to talk to Dr. Kirk Erickson, who's also a scientific advisor to MedRhythms, where his research is around really exercise to cognition through neuroimaging research. But he does a lot about the hippocampus, which we haven't talked at all today about in sort of the correlation between exercise. But there seems to be, in particularly as you mentioned in the aging population, so much emerging about the importance of this correlation between exercise and the facets that are within cognition. But I really like this sort of sentiment about the reward system, right? So how do we make exercise rewarding when it's perhaps inherently not rewarding for many people, right? And, you know, perhaps music is the way.
Well, you know, it is interesting, and people, you know, you have to differentiate exercise from physical activity because they are two different things. You can do a lot of physical activity that is not exercise. So physical activity can have a significant impact on cognition. When you think about exercise, it can be, you know, pumping iron or, you know, or cardiovascular kinds of things, but it may be just activity. And so walking, you know, of course, is physical activity. It could be exercise or not, depending on how much you do, how much you put out, you know. So physical activity can have a huge effect. And of course, you know, Kirk has done a lot of the work in aging. And of course, you're right, through the hippocampus. And we do have some preliminary data ourselves looking at exercise, particularly cycloergometry and its effect on memory through the hippocampus. We have some preliminary data, both in MS and in traumatic brain injury. So, you know, the brain works as a whole. We don't sort of like stimulate this little part and that little part, even though we can measure those little things. But when we exercise, or when we think, or when we do a cognitive exercise, we're stimulating the entire brain. We're getting the entire brain to work more efficiently. And you're going to see, you can look at one area of the brain, but it's all working together. And that's the key, is getting it, if you've had an injury, getting it back to working together as much as possible.
Right. And which always brings to mind, shameless plug with my background, a great way to engage the entire brain is music, right? It's playing music, engaging in music. I happen to know, John, that you are a musician as background. Can you tell us more about your background in music?
Sure. I've been playing music for many decades, and I won't tell you how many, but a lot. And I'm primarily guitar and vocals. I play currently in an acoustic trio, which is primarily a vocal band. And I've been playing for a long time, and for me, music is one of my first loves and long-standing loves. And there's nothing like three-part harmony, you know, and there's just something about it. But there's the physical activity of playing an instrument, and there's the mental appreciation of people working together. You think about like a a basketball team or a soccer team working together. And when you're playing in an acoustic trio, people are working together. Very cognitive, very mobile, a lot of activity going on. And it's very rewarding. And something, it's rewarding. You tend to do it over and over. So yeah, it's true. I've been playing for a long time.
Any favorite genres or artists that come to mind?
Interesting. I must say I'm not a big fan of modern. I don't even know the names of rap music. Music's fine, okay. I tend to like what would you call it? I guess you would call it. I wouldn't say country rock. Not country music. I'm more like of a softer sound, but I like harmony.
Mm.
I like music with a lot of vocal,
yes.
A lot of vocal harmony. I like complicated music, but I also like it. I like a nice structure to the music. That really sort of makes me sort of nod my head a little bit.
I love that. And it's so interesting, John, because when I was treating patients full time in the hospital, one of the first questions that I would ask patients upon an assessment was what kind of music that they like. And that was number one, so that we could incorporate familiar, rewarding music into the sessions and whatever we were working on, but also as a way of just creating that relationship. Just tell me more about yourself. Tell me what kind of music that you like. And what I found so compelling and actually very interesting about your answer as well is that it was much easier for people to tell me what kind of music they didn't like than it was for them to actually name a genre. Because I think that most people come from even, I would say, not even eclectic backgrounds, but say there's so much vast music that is out there that I can appreciate and that I enjoy. But there's much more specifically this genre of music that I don't, which I always find very
funny. That's funny.
Well, good. And just to wrap up here, John, I ask all of of our guests on the show this particular question to end. And usually I talk about the future of the research that they're doing. We've talked a lot about lots of different research happening that you're a part of, that the Kessler Foundation is a part of. And so I'll leave this maybe a little bit more open-ended for you to answer. But what does the future of research look like, in your opinion? Where are we headed?
We're headed in better health. We really are learning about how we can improve the lives of people with disabilities. And there's a lot of promise out there. You could think about over hundreds of years ago, when people would have a disability, they would just think that they would be in institutions. There were people, even with obvious problems, intellectual disabilities, such as Down syndrome. And you would think of, what these people can't do anything. But we think about abilities with people with disability and what they can do. And there are so many things that populations can do even better than the average individual. Persons with autism are very good at focusing on something. And let's get them to do a task that you really need a lot of focus on. Why not look at what they can do? So I think the research is showing that the environment can help persons with have problems in the nervous system, and that's going to translate in improving their everyday lives, which is going to make people happier, and it's going to make just everything work a lot better. Research is the answer. Research is the answer to treatment, and it's the answer to enjoyment and happiness in life. So I think we've got a lot of good things to look forward to.
I love that. Research is the answer to treatment. I think that's beautiful, John. So thank you for that. Thank you for the conversation today. It's always an honor and a pleasure to talk with you. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. And for all those that are watching, keep an eye out also for our next episode, which will be in July with Dr. Kirk Erickson from the University of Pittsburgh. As a reminder, if you'd like to watch this episode again or learn more about MedRhythms and the work that we're doing here, you can check out our website at www.medrhythms.com. So thanks again for tuning in. And John, thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Brian.